So one of the things you and I debate a lot is what is the value of research to creatives, to creative work, and where is the challenge that it presents or the obstacle that it presents. So what do you see as a creative? What do you see as the goal of research? And it's in its best form, what can research do to help you?
For me, and for when working with strategists and researchers, research basically comes up what I call my favorite rock band, the H and the 5 Ws. All right. So
You'll take me through that.
Who, what, where, when, why, and how. That's what I want to come out of research, right? So it's setting up all those things that my team is going to use to identify the problem, who the problem's for, where it's happening, how to solve it, et cetera. So that is the ideal goal that comes out of research, and that research gets then put into the initial strategy document for myself and my team, which is a creative brief. So that's what I want outside of that when coming out of research is to get to that result.
And what do you think the challenges are to achieving that? I mean, that seems like a simple ask, right? So what are the most common obstacles that you think clients have or marketers have when working with you to deliver that to you?
I think it's hard to often get to those salient points depending on what the research activity is. It takes time often. And so sometimes people like to shortcut it and just make assumptions based off of previous research or previous histories, and they just, our target's always this, and et cetera, which sometimes is totally acceptable and fine. And you can do that. But I do think far too often that people, whether they be researchers due to the nature of the project, whether it's creative people who are involved or even clients, take too many shortcuts to not fill in those salient things and update them to be relevant in the moment.
And this is a really important point that I think you're bringing up, because you need to be strategic at every point in the process, don't you? We can't simply do a data dump on a creative team and think that they can sort through it and make sense of it and have the salient points that are going to inspire good creative, right? So we have to be choiceful in the research process. We have to be choiceful at the strategy phase that's using the research, just as much as we have to be choiceful and thoughtful at the creative stage, would you say?
Absolutely. And I think it's got to be sort of crafted for every endeavor that you're doing. Rinse and repeat can work sometimes, depending on what's going on, but I do think that identifying those items in the moment to make them most relevant is really important, and distilling them for my team when we get to that point where they're going to start executing. While some creatives look to drink from the fire hose and absorb all the data, that's giving them a little bit too much freedom to decide what's relevant and what isn't, as opposed to making sure you deliver a document or delivering something that's been, for lack of a better word, vetted and controlled to guide them down an appropriate path. So what do you think the goal of research is from a non-creative perspective?
I can probably tell you about the sort of from the marketing and the business view a little bit. I straddle both that advertising and businessy side. So I think the need for marketers and the emphasis on research and data is an important one, because, marketers are part of the business and they have to evidence that they are data-driven people and they're making decisions not by the seat of their pants, but that it's based on some kind of an empirically driven process. They need that to kind of lay the foundations to make the argument for creative work. So I think that's a real important need around it. One of the challenges, though, I do think that exists for marketers is to know what kind of research to do at what stage in order to result in what everybody wants, which is stellar creative and amazing communications and strong brands. And that's the rub, right, where you've got to really make sure that you're commissioning and putting energy and effort toward the kinds of research that are going to help, say, for example, your advertising team or your creative team get the insights they need to do really breakthrough work.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I do think not all research is equal, right? If it's not focused on what the end goal is and what the nature of the endeavor is, it's not necessarily relevant. Unfortunately, I do think a lot of people sort of batch it all together as the same thing, regardless of what's actually happening.
Now, you said not all research is created equal, and I think that's a really spot-on comment. And understandably, like throughout my career, I've worked with creative teams who've been really allergic to any kind of research. And that's totally understandable in a way because they have not necessarily experienced research that actually helps and enhances the creative process. And that can be really tricky. So sometimes one of the things that I think helps agencies and creative teams in particular is understand you have to be part of that research conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's imperative that someone from the creative team, if not multiple members, are involved at the research level, even just for their own edification as to what's happening. Mm-hmm. But I think it's unless you've been gifted, as I have many times, with a strategist who understands what creatives are looking for and what creatives need, having that voice during the research process to help sort of, quite frankly, just raise their hand and say, this isn't going to help me. I need something like this. You get so much better results.
Well, you and I, when we've worked together, that's how we've worked best, right? So, as a creative director, one of the most valuable things you can do is be able to have some knowledge on guiding the kind of research that you need. Because not all research is bad, of course. Just bad research is bad. And so as the creative voice at the table, you can influence it. I think you can have a lot more influence than you necessarily think you can to help your clients, to help the marketing team identify and advocate for and fund the kind of research that's going to influence the creative output and help you get more effective, more award-winning work.
Yeah, it's absolutely key. It has to happen that way, or you'll end up getting research that isn't relevant to the goals that you're trying to achieve, and it's too late then. What kind of advice would you give to a creative team so they can advocate for the kind of research that they need?
In general, it's about, and this isn't rocket science, but it's about investing in research in the upfront. So doing research at the beginning of the process before creative development has begun, before even perhaps a creative brief has been written. Because exploratory research that informs the thinking and gives you a foundational understanding of your consumer or your target audience, their context, their life, and the market, that can help you ground empirically the creative brief and what the strategy needs to be. Because of tighter budgets and more aggressive timelines, perhaps exploratory research is viewed as a bit of a luxury or something that we can't afford as marketers. But I really would encourage any teams and creative teams working with clients, see what you can do to get some of that upfront exploratory. And it doesn't have to be totally expensive. You could do some kind of observational work, some ethnographic work, and even have your creatives do it if you need to. But doing the upfront insights are going to help you as a creative team really build the foundation for what your creative strategy is. And it helps your client because, as we said a moment ago, clients really need to prove that they are data-driven.
Absolutely. And I would say it has to be before the creative brief. I think far too often that creative brief is done more like a necessity as an obligation more than a necessity. And that the fact of the matter is if you've written a brief before you've done your research, it's too late. The brief is the touchstone that's going to guide the whole project. And if the research comes afterwards, the reality is you're going to have to rewrite the brief. Unless you get lucky and it just happens to align with it. But it's if you don't have that insight beforehand, you probably don't have anything other than a tactical project brief. You don't really have a creative brief.
The next phase of research where you often see the client commissioning work is in evaluating or testing creative work or validating things. And I can see your skin crawling as I even, suggest this to you. But in many cases, I'm not saying every client and marketing team does research to test creative concepts, but more times than not, they do. Would you agree?
I would say it's fairly common, and unfortunately, it's usually done maybe in lieu of that upfront research and upfront strategy in order to protect the final output from ruffling feathers or being off brief. But I'm not a big fan of testing, as you and I have discussed many times before. And to be fair, I like the idea of validating a creative endeavor, whether it's product design, whether it's marketing, whether it's advertising. I think there is a place for testing. I think, unfortunately, a lot of the testing I've been a part of, the nature of it is unnatural and leads to what it's basically in physics. It's called the observer theory, right? By observing it, you're changing what the result will be. By putting people in a room that's unnatural and asking them questions about something or putting stimuli in front of them, they are put in a position where they either are going to placate or become performative, or they're going to shrink back. They're not going to be themselves. We've seen this in election polls that people come out and tell people what they think they're supposed to tell them as opposed to what their behavior or opinions are. And so I've seen it happen, and so maybe I have a bias for it. But I do think that there are certain modes of testing that are inherently biased and won't be accurate to how people react to it.
So what you just described, I'm going to say, is a version of the perception that creatives have that research will kill creative, or research is detrimental.
Yeah, absolutely. It's absolutely detrimental. No, it's not. If it's done right, it's not. If it's done wrong, absolutely. But I mean, I went to college. I didn't grow up. I went to college in a market test city.
Yeah, you didn't grow up.
No, I still haven't grown up. But I went to college where they did product market testing, where they'd go out and they'd put it out in the wild into stores and see how it would perform. And it was very, at a young age, before I ever was in advertising, it was very informative of how these things actually would come to life. I would watch people adopt brands they'd never heard of, both good, bad, or indifferent. But that's out in the wild. It's people spending real money. They're consuming real products, and so I think that's a great way to test. That's expensive. It has its own drawbacks to it, but it's at least much like wildlife photography. It's witnessing the animals in their own environment and not trying to change their behavior or actions.
Well, yeah, and seeing something in the real world and doing a true market test, I think, is really, really valuable. And in packaging, that's a little more feasible than in advertising, right? Because the cost of producing the ad and running it in a market, well, if it's not right, then you're kind of up the creek without a paddle. Or very expensive creek,
yeah.
Right, to redo it. So it might be valuable for us to talk about a little bit about, if you're in a situation where the client is going to be bringing your concepts to research, whether you like it or not, what are the ways you can at least get some value and a bit of a read on how it might be doing? Now, I hear you on your resistance to that, and we've had many traveling on trips, we've had many debates over beverages, over this issue. But there's a couple things that you can do when it comes to a situation where your client is wants to test the concepts, right? My personal belief is that research at the concept testing stage, or what I call communications checks, I don't like to call them testing because it's a check on the communication, which is what is the concept communicating, is a useful step, because you as the creative can understand, is what I intended to convey coming through? Are they interpreting and internalizing my creative idea the way that I wanted them to? So you really only can put it in front of people to understand how they're interpreting it. But I think the important thing is that communications test and testing your advertising, and I'm talking about in a qualitative setting, shouldn't be about picking a winner. It shouldn't be a beauty contest. And you should not rely on consumers. This might be a little controversial, but I actually don't think you should listen to consumers about which one you should run. What you can do, because consumers aren't creatives and they aren't marketing specialists per se. They're getting very savvy about marketing for sure, but they don't know the business as well as you and your clients do. But what you can do in a communications check is understand, is the concept on brief? Are the target audience internalizing and understanding the creative idea as the way I intended it? And third, does it delight them? Is there something about the creative idea that sparks something? If you can get that from the research, it's going to help you advise your clients and work with your team to both inform which ones they may think have the best potential to build the brand or sell the product, and which ones might be fresh and new, and how to make them better, right? It's all about understanding what works, what doesn't work, and how can it be better.